Now, once you find that out, you can remove those barriers because that try stuff is probably not internal, it's probably external. And then we have the high intrinsic motivation, increased engagement, greater satisfaction, improved performance, enhanced creativity flow, and then positive emotional return. So self-determination theory, again, the structure for dynamic leadership. Intrinsic motivation is joy from the activity itself. Extrinsic motivation, reasons other than the act itself or the activity itself. You want to screenshot that so you see the bottom, but people are driven by their own interests, values, and passions. And you can tap those into the workplace. You can tap into those in the workplace. And I'll mention that a little bit later, but that's more part of dynamic leadership. It's why we do what we do in dynamic leadership. So self-determination theory, again, structure for dynamic leadership, intrinsic motivation, enjoyment from the activity itself. Now we see that we have connection to purpose, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, the needs. Intrinsic motivation goes up and the internal need to grow and attain fulfillment is met. And when that's met, you're getting dopamine, which is the habit neurotransmitter, habit-forming neurotransmitter, and you have serotonin boosting, which is the feel-good neurotransmitter. And this is where you get the repeated behavior. Remember, dopamine and serotonin is what's at play in the hunter-gatherer environment when it came time to risking their life to go out and hunt and gather. It was the dopamine that was driving that. It was the serotonin that caused that. So the dopamine is powerful enough to go out and face that Serengeti tiger. Clearly, we should be thinking about it as it relates to work. And this is where the conditioning comes in. So those leaders that I was talking about earlier who had these set of conditioned behaviors, for whatever reason in their upbringing, their mentoring, whatever happened in their life, they built in this conditioning, these habits that led them to be effective leaders in a corporate environment. But that doesn't necessarily make them effective leaders in an entrepreneurial environment where the needs are different. One is you are where the buck stops, whereas in a workplace, the organization infrastructure is there, the board is there. So while the buck may stop with me as an executive in a corporation, it doesn't really stop with me because I've got all these backstops. I've got the legal department, I've got the compliance department, I have somebody doing research, the R&D, and I have the board, and I have other leaders. It's a lot more that you don't have. And so when the corporate leader makes that shift to an entrepreneurial environment, they have to deal with how do they handle all of that uncertainty? How do they handle that lack of connectedness? How do they handle that? And it could be catastrophic because it taps into maybe some fears that they've never had to face. So this is more detail. You can take a screenshot, but you see over on the right, I talk about the 6 human needs: significance, connection, certainty, and variety. And these sort of map to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I say sort of, they do, but he chose to use Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the physiological, the security, the love, the esteem, and then the self-actualization. And that to me is where the growth and contribution come into play, is that the self-actualization. I think that's a more practical way of looking at it. And you see at the bottom, I have focusing on growth and contribution, serve the other 4. Why intrinsic motivation? Motherhood and apple pie stuff. People access the best version of themselves. It's easier for people to maintain a growth mindset, and extrinsic motivation requires resources and time. So if I'm externally motivating somebody as the leader, I've got to do things. Now, maybe it's setting up an incentive, and I've done incentive programs for large groups, senior field leaders. I did those incentive programs, and because I was in sales operations. And one of the things that was interesting is that I don't care how good you make the incentive program, people always leave money on the table. You have this group that goes after it all the time. They go after that top level. You have this group that wants to survive. You have the group in the middle that is trying to thrive, and they leave a lot of money on the table. And it gets into the self-determination theory and intrinsic motivation. When you have that gap where their capabilities are here and they're leaving money on the table, instead of adding more incentives to try to get in there, start looking at what's going on with the autonomy, competency, and relatedness. Because as you start seeing them, and especially in sales, a lot of times sales leaders are under this impression that the incentive is enough, the commission is enough, and they stop seeing the people, they stop paying attention to their needs, and then they leave money on the table. Just by leaning into the self-determination pillars, you can start tapping into